Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. What was Jesus doing on Spy Wednesday? Spy Wednesday is, quite frankly, one of the most sobering, one of the most awakening days in Holy Week. In the church's memory, we are meant to focus on Judas's work of betrayal. If you contrast some of the Gospels, Matthew and Mark place a particular scene about the anointing, the costly anointing at Bethany. He places that directly beside Judas's arrangement with the chief priests. So in other words, if you read Matthew and Mark, Jesus is anointed by costly nard by a woman, and then immediately after that, Judas arranges to betray Jesus. And you see the contrast between love and treason in that same stretch of time. Luke, however, places his emphasis of Judas's conspiracy and a little after that, and he focuses the conspiracy in telling us that Satan entered Judas. John preserves the identity of the woman as Mary of Bethany. So between the four Gospels, you get a fuller picture here. He roots the whole scene, actually, in the household of Lazarus in Bethany. Martha and Mary are there, obviously. You take that together, you get that bigger human portrait. Now, by this stage in the week, Jesus had already spent long days teaching publicly in Jerusalem. Luke actually tells us that during the day he was teaching in the temple area, and at night he would leave and stay at the Mount of Olives and pray. People were rising early to hear him, and that line matters. There's a certain rhythm to these final days. Even before his crucifixion, Jesus was about the work of evangelization. He was about the work of preaching this good news that is himself. He was pouring himself out in instruction. And then he would withdraw toward Bethany and the slope of Olivet by night. So when Christians talk about Wednesday in Bethany, we get that from Luke, largely. Matthew begins this section with Jesus speaking with full awareness. He knows what's coming. In 2 days' time it will be Passover, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. And he's speaking plainly at this point. The chief priests and the elders assembled in the palace of Caiaphas and consulted together to arrest him by treachery, and then to put him to death. Mark gives that same broad sequence. And he actually adds that the chief priests were afraid of public unrest during the festival. So Jesus went into Spy Wednesday, and there was no illusion. The people were heralding him as a new Davidic king, and the Pharisees and the scribes and teachers of the law were planning his demise. He walked knowingly towards his own sacrifice. He wasn't a victim of blind fate. But let's focus on the place of Bethany for a bit. As I mentioned earlier, in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, Jesus is in the house of Simon the leper. He's reclining at table when a woman enters with an alabaster jar of costly perfumed oil, nard, spikenard or nard, and pours it upon his head. John gives the household setting a little fuller. This is 6 days before the Passover. Jesus comes to Bethany, where Lazarus was. Martha served him, and then Mary took costly nard or spikenard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped them with her hair. This is the Lazarus that Jesus raised from the dead. John's own note says that this scene is probably the same event remembered by Matthew and Mark, but the details are told from different angles, so to speak. The fuller picture has a certain density here. The woman is Mary of Bethany. The setting is a dinner in Bethany. There's an association with Simon the leper, but also with the family that loved Jesus and whom Jesus loved. The anointing in Matthew and Mark's version touches Jesus' head, and in John's version touches Jesus' feet. So suffice to say that if we piece the imagery together, all of Jesus had been anointed by this holy oil, this sweet-scented oil. And it's meant to be a kind of anointing that signifies the anointing of the church itself. The fragrance of Christ fills the house of the church. And Jesus then speaks about that act very clearly. He says, she has done a good thing for him. In Mark's gospel, he says, she has anticipated anointing my body for burial. He's very explicit at this point. In Matthew, he says, she did it to prepare me for burial. John, let her keep this for the day of my burial. So on Spy Wednesday, Jesus gets anointed before death. His anointing prefigures his death. Mary of Bethany, by love, enters this mystery early. She seems to understand, or at least have a grasp, that this this rabbi whom she loves is going to die. So there's a kind of holy instinct, if you will. And so her lavish devotion, by the way, this was a year's worth of day laborers' wages, 365 denarii. That's no joke. She gave to Christ what people at the time would have called simply excessive. And Christ actually said, no, this is fitting, this is timely, this is beautiful, this is not excessive. Now, Judas becomes that extra figure here. Matthew says the disciples were indignant at the expense. Mark says some were indignant. Then John narrows it down and he says, actually, the objection was just Judas. And he says plainly, Judas spoke this way because he was a thief who used to steal from the money bag. Now, there's a few justifications here. One of which is it was common for people to contribute to the ministry of Jesus and the apostles. Judas kept the money bag. So the cost of 365 denarii could have gone into the money bag, and Judas would have happily helped himself to it. You put all of these testimonies together, and you really see the ripening of a life of sin. This minor interior decay where he helps himself from a little bit of money to a little bit of money. He's cloaked in greed. Now, of course, he couches it in language of concern for the poor. In that sense, it's right to say Judas was the first overtly social justice individual. The social doctrine of the church is beautiful, but when you divorce it from the gospel of salvation, it becomes destructive. Judas then goes to the chief priests. He accepts money, which, by the way, 30 silver pieces is not a lot of money to betray the messianic figure of all of Israel. But then he seeks an opportunity. And so his dissent is chilling because lest we think that Judas was particularly evil, there's a real fallen humanness to this. Sin starts off small and then reaches a ripening in destructiveness. It starts with a tolerated small amount of sin and it grows. Matthew gives us the famous sum. He's the only one. He says it's 30 pieces of silver. That detail comes from the book of Jeremiah. It's the price of a slave, and so it presses the humiliation of Christ into the very language of the Old Testament. Luke then adds one more significant detail. Judas sought a favorable opportunity to hand Jesus over in the absence of a crowd. Why? Because they were afraid that the crowd would riot and release Jesus. Judas was an insider. He knew what the hidden opening would be. He knew the patterns of Jesus. And I need you to picture the scenario too, that it is dark. They just had the Last Supper, and it is dark in the Mount of Olives. It is a position full of pressure, and there's a large crowd there, the crowd that came with the temple officials. In order to identify the right person in that darkness, Judas does what disciples regularly did for their rabbis as a sign of devotion and fidelity. He kissed him on the cheek. So in other words, this was something Judas and all the other apostles had done for Jesus before, multiple times. This act of fidelity and intimacy was what becomes perverted to become the sign of his betrayal. So what was Jesus doing on Spy Wednesday? He was receiving love from those who recognize his worth, and he was permitting his burial anointing before his passion. He dwells among friends in Bethany. He was knowingly advancing toward the Passover as the true lamb. Now, if we read the biblical accounts right, the betrayal and arrest of Jesus will happen on Holy Thursday. But Judas is already orchestrating everything. This day, however, has a lot to do with the scriptures and therefore a lot to do with our own hearts. Spy Wednesday actually asks us, are we bringing Jesus our most expensive, costliest devotion, or are we secretly betraying him in our little sins, and sometimes big sins that we know of? Are we making the steps to fight those sins by seeking him? Are we giving him more than what we think is reasonable? We ought to be giving him everything. As Paul says, that Christ may be all in all. This day in Holy Week leads us to this blazing center. Jesus gives himself for us entirely. He seals a new covenant in his blood. And so he asks us right now, will we give him everything in return? So as we take a look at the betrayal of Judas, ask ourselves, are we searching the Judas within? Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter.